Hello. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can connect Okta Workflows to an on-premise system or application. This connection can be used for both user access provisioning as well as for reference purposes. Before we get started, I wanted to walk you through a high-level overview of what we're going to be configuring. In this video, we're going to be connecting Okta Workflows to an on-premise Active Directory environment. And to do so, we're going to be using the Mulesoft Anypoint platform. There's two main components of the Mulesoft platform we'll be configuring today. The first is a LDAP connector, which essentially will translate HTTP commands from Okta Workflows into LDAP commands to Active Directory, and vice versa. The second part of this integration will be an API gateway proxy. And what that'll be responsible for is securely hosting this logic out to the cloud, out to Okta Workflows, and also performing the OAuth 2 authentication that's required to perform that in a secure manner. So those are the components we'll be configuring today in the video. So to set up this integration using the Mulesoft platform, there's a number of prerequisites that must be satisfied. First, of course, you'll need an Okta tenant with workflows. Second, in order to protect the API using OAuth, you'll also need API access management Okta SKU enabled for your workflows org or another Okta tenant. And you'll need an access to an Anypoint platform. There's free trials available if you don't have them. Otherwise, you can use the Anypoint tenant that you already own. You'll need an on-premise server that's going to host the Anypoint runtime agent. And what this is this is where the LDAP translation code is going to run, and it's going to provide that tunnel into the on-premise environment. And then finally, you'll need service account credentials to the LDAP repository that we're going to be querying. So once you have all those prerequisites fulfilled, we'll go ahead and start the configuration. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the Anypoint platform. The first step in that is to go to the Runtime Manager. And this actually involves standing up and configuring the server that is going to be on premise next to your LDAP directory. And so in order to get that going, we have to add a server to the landscape. And what happens basically is you install the Mule runtime on the server, and you use this enrollment token right here to associate with the Anypoint platform. And that allows for Anypoint to deploy code, to execute things, things of that nature. So we have to deploy a server first, and we're just going to call it LDAP server. And what we also need is we need the software to install on the server. So you can go ahead and open that up. And we need to download and install Mule. So right here, I've actually found that this link for some reason works better in Safari, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay, so I'm going to agree and download the trial. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually put it onto my server. Okay, I'm going to upload it there. Go ahead and log into my server. Okay, so I'm not logged into my Mule server now. You can see my Mule distribution there. One of the prerequisites that's called out here is we do need to make sure Java is installed. So I'm going to go ahead and install Java. It's already installed on my environment, but in case it's not on yours, so I'll go ahead and do my Java version, and I have that installed. So now I'm going to go ahead and unzip that. Okay, so if I go into bin, you'll see there's the AMC setup. So I'm going to take that command from my Anypoint here. I'm going to take that right there and run that. Okay. So you can see there's a bunch of stuff it did to communicate with, with the Anypoint platform, and it's now associated. Oh, and I need to actually execute Mule. That would help. So this is going to run the Mulesoft agent. And we'll see once that's done, we'll actually see this running in the Anypoint platform. So, okay, so that's all it takes to set up the agent on premise with the Mulesoft Anypoint platform. Now we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so now that we have our server onboarded, we're going to next set up the endpoint that will actually execute the LDAP commands. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over from the runtime manager over to the design center. We're going to create a new Mule app here. So a new Mule app, and I'll call it whatever I'd like to call it, LDAP Workflow, for example. Go ahead and create that, and then we're going to be presented with a trigger, which is the thing that's going to actually cause the flow to run. Right here, we're going to do an HTTP trigger here. And it's just a listener there, so you can just hit next. And this here is an LDAP connector. And for this example, we're just going to do an LDAP search. So here, we can certainly do other things as well, but I'm just doing a search here. So what that's going to do is it's going to create the Mule flow for me, and it's going to kind of get that all set up. So what I'd like to do here, this is the HTTP endpoint that's going to be invoked. So that'll just be in the flow pack, it's search LDAP here. So I'm going to go ahead and put that there. And then the only other thing that has to be done here is we do want to put a response header that's in JSON format. So I'm going to go ahead and add that content type here. Go ahead and put that there, and then I'm done with that piece. Then secondly, we've got our LDAP connector. We're going to configure that. So you go ahead and put in the base DN of what you'd like to search. For me, I'm just going to do the root of my domain. The filter, what we want to put in there is we actually want to take the Q query string from the input, and we're going to pass it in there. So in order to do that, I'm going to go ahead and get that value here. Put that in there. So essentially, we're going to take a query string parameter called Q that came in on the HTTP request, and we're going to map that to the filter. Change that to subtree. And then for these are the return attributes, so you can add whatever you'd like here. But these are the actual LDAP attributes. So if I just want to get maybe the given name, surname, and perhaps let's just do like SAM account name, because this is Active Directory as an example. So those three attributes I'm going to grab. And then the next piece is I need to set up the actual connection. What this is this defines the network path that we're going to call and the credentials we're going to use. Now, most of this stuff is not really needed right now because it gets configured at runtime or at deployment time, so to speak. So I'm going to create a new LDAP connection here. And I want it to be, and you can choose if you're on premise, you want to do TLS or basic. Yeah, it's up to you. It's essentially the same configuration. Either way, it just determines the port that you're going to use. So in my case, I'll just use a basic configuration. And again, these parts don't matter. We're going to be specifying them at runtime. You can go ahead and save that. So we're using that LDAP connection. And then the next thing we're going to do is we're finally going to add a transform at the end. Because what's happening here is we're getting data in from the HTTP connection, transforming it into the format that the LDAP connector needs. The LDAP connector is going to query and run its LDAP bits. And then we need to transform that back into JSON. So we're going to do that here. And I do have an output for you, an example of my documentation here that you can use. I'll just paste that in here. But essentially, these are the fields in the JSON, and these are the attributes from the LDAP, right? So I think I did give name, surname. I think I just did SAM account name. I didn't do UPN. So essentially, this would map the three. So these are what I configured in the last step, and then this is what the output is going to be in the JSON back to Okta Workflows. Okay, so I'll go ahead and save that. And I am finished configuring the connection. All I need to do to deploy it is I need to click on these little three ellipses here. I need to export. And what this does, I'm going to export as a Mule application. And what this will actually do is this will compile a jar for me that I'm going to deploy to my Mule runtime. I'll go ahead and keep that. And we'll use that in the next step as we deploy it to our server. So to do that, let's go over to the Runtime Manager. And we will click on the Deploy Application button here. Give it a name, whatever you want to call it. We're going to deploy it to our server that we stood up. And then we are going to pick the application file that we downloaded. Before we deploy, what we're going to do is we have a few properties to set. And remember before I said that some of the details of the connection were left for deployment time, and this is that time. So there's a number of attributes we have to set up here for the URL, for example. So go ahead and put that in. That's going to be your LDAP server there. And then just going to add a few of these in here. Okay, I've got the LDAP connectivity details there now. And then we're finally going to add some of the deployment details of the HTTP side of the house. So what ports is it going to listen on? What IP address is it going to listen on? So we'll add a few of those parameters here too. Okay, so now we're complete with our parameters. And before I deploy this, I wanted to explain real quick why I chose these values here. The reason why I chose these values is, remember this Mule app is going to be listening via HTTP, and we don't actually want this layer to be exposed externally. We want to wrap this entire thing in an API gateway. So this IP address, I'm deploying an API gateway on the same server as the Mule app. This may be some other internal IP address that's accessible only to the API gateway. So the API gateway is going to add an extra layer of security on top of this. And so this is essentially a non-public IP address. In my case, I'm listening localhost only. The API gateway is going to be responsible for hosting it externally. So that's why we have a localhost IP address here. In a real implementation, this may be some other internal IP address that the API gateway will protect. So that's why that is set up that way. So to finish off, I'm going to go ahead and deploy my application. And you'll see that the deployment is starting. We will see it is now started. So before we complete the Mulesoft configuration, I thought I'd log into the server and do a quick test. This test will confirm two different things. The first of all, it will confirm that all of my parameters are set up properly. And then secondly, it also just gives a better view into what's actually going on here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. I'm on the server where I'm running Mule the Muleflow, this LDAP server here. I'm on this server. I'm going to go ahead and run this wget command right here. So essentially this is just a quick call of the service. As you can see when I run that, this is actually going to connect to my LDAP server as configured. It's going to log in with that service account. It's going to execute an LDAP query as defined here, and it's going to output the results in JSON format as I specified in my mapping. So if I was to update that and maybe change that a little bit, you'll see that there's some additional steps here. So it's obvious this is actually querying my LDAP store. So now I'm ready to move on to the actual API gateway, which is going to make this service publicly available in a secure manner. Okay, so now that we have our LDAP service, the next step is to actually expose it externally to Okta Workflows in a secure fashion. But before we can do that, we actually have to create the proper OAuth infrastructure within Okta. And there's two components we have to set up. The first is a OAuth 2 client that Okta Workflows will use to authenticate. And the second is an authorization server that will actually mint the tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and create the application first. And so we'll go ahead and do that. We'll go into the Applications tab of Okta, add an application, and I am going to create a new app here. It's going to be an OpenID Connect app. I might call it On-Premise LDAP Service. The redirect URI here, remember this is Okta Workflows calling this authorization server. So we're going to want, there's actually a callback URL I can provide for you here. Right here. Now save that. And so the only thing we're going to want to change here is we will want refresh tokens. We're going to want the refresh tokens to be available. And we're going to get rid of the consent here. And that should be all we have to change there. Then what we're going to do is we're going to assign a user to it. You might create a dedicated agent user for this, or just assign yourself to it. Okay, I'll assign my user to it. And that step is complete. So now what we're going to do is we're going to create our authorization server. So we go into Security API. We're going to add an authorization service. Now the audience here is important. We want to save that off. We need to provide this to Mulesoft. So I might call it LDAP service. It can be whatever you'd like, but do keep track of it. Okay, so now we have our service. What's going to be important here are some of these URLs here for later. But the first thing we're going to do is we just need to create a scope that the Workflows engine can request. So I'm just going to create a sample scope. Okay, and that should be it. And then the last piece we need to know, and this is why we created the app first, we need to create an access policy that will allow the client that we created access to get tokens. So this is the app we just created here. We need to grant it access to call our authorization service. Okay, we'll add a rule saying we can use the authorization code flow. That's the one that's important. And then we want to be able to do offline access, so refresh tokens, and then also we want that API read scope we just created. And that should be it. Okay, so now we have our access policy. Now it's time to deploy the API. Now it's time to actually deploy the API proxy that's going to be used to expose it to the outside world in a secure manner. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go over to the API Manager section of the Anypoint platform, and we're going to create a new API, and we can give it whatever name you'd like. Whatever you'd like. It's going to be an HTTP API here. We'll continue. It's going to be an endpoint with Proxy. It's going to be running in hybrid mode. We are running Mule 4 or above. And then the implementation API is the internal URL that we're going to be exposing. So, again, this API proxy is going to run on the same server as the internal service, and so localhost is appropriate here. The TLS here, this is TLS for communications with the internal service. In this particular example, we don't have that, so we can skip that piece. We have search LDAP as the path, like the root path that we will be calling from Okta Workflows. In this case, this is actually the externally facing HTTPS. So we will want this. I'll leave the configuration of TLS out of the scope of this video, but that's something you'll want to do is upload your server certs here and select those for hosting TLS. And then we can change our port. I think I might be using this one already. Maybe I'll use that. And that should do it here. I'll save that. And then finally, before we deploy it, what we're going to do is we're going to set some policies up, a policy up. Because right now, if we were to deploy this, it would be open to the world with no authentication. So we'll go ahead and apply a policy, and there's a bunch of different policies we can use, but I'm going to use one called the JWT validation. And this is the thing that's going to validate the access token that Okta mints. So in order to set that up, these are all appropriate. RSA 256, that's appropriate. One thing we're going to change is we're going to set up the JWKS endpoint. This is an endpoint where the Muleflow will actually download the signing keys directly from Okta. So this URL can actually be found in Okta underneath the authorization server here in this metadata URI. And that's actually this piece here. And the field we want is the JWKS URI. So it ends in keys, so we're going to grab that. We're going to plop that in to the Anypoint platform there. We can set up some caching of that. It doesn't reach out and refresh every time, but it'll essentially pull Okta for the signing keys. For this, we can skip the client ID validation, but we are going to validate the audience claim. And then we could also do the audience claim there. And then I'm going to grab my audience, which is this value right here. I think I said to save that earlier. Grab that. And then we will apply. And essentially what that means then is in order to call this API, you'll need to present a valid JWT that's been minted by this authorization server here. So with that, we're ready to deploy. And let's go back into our API and go down to the deployment. So we'll select our target, and we will pick our LDAP server that we had stood up earlier, and we will deploy. We run over here, you can see we starting the app here, and we are running. We apply our policy, and we are ready to go. So now at this point, we have an API exposed out to Okta Workflows that we can then call in our processes. So the next step, what we're going to do is we're going to actually configure Okta Workflows. Now that we have all of our on-premise components deployed, now it's time to configure Okta Workflows. So the first step is we're actually going to set up our authentication that's going to be used for the connection. So to do that, we're going to come into the Connections tab of Okta Workflows. We're going to create a new connection. It's going to be an HTTP connection, and we're going to use the OAuth authentication type. We can name it whatever you'd like. We're going to call it the on-premise LDAP demo. The authorized path is if you go into your authorization server, you'll see the metadata URI. The easiest way to get it is just to go to the metadata URI, grab the authorized path, put that in the workflow. The token path is going to be the same, except instead of authorized, it'll just be token. The scope will be API read, as we created earlier in the setup. and then also with a space, and then we'll do offline access, which will allow the Workflows engine to get a refresh token so you won't have to redo this all the time. The client ID is the client that we set up earlier, which is this guy right here earlier on in the walkthrough. And so we're going to grab that client ID, throw that in here, and then the client secret, throw that in there as well. And we will authorize. Now, I'm already logged into this tenant, so it's pretty much just going to blip through, but you may have to log in if you're not already logged in. At that point, I've gone ahead and I've already authenticated into the platform. So now what we're going to do is we will go ahead and import our flow pack. So I create a folder called on-premise demo. You can put in any of the folders you wish, but I will import, choose a file, and I've got my flow pack here. Going to bring that in, and what that's going to do is essentially this is just a flow that takes in as an argument. It takes in an LDAP filter as an argument, and it returns back a JSON list of objects that that are matching LDAP entries. So if we click into that, you'll see that LDAP filter there. We're going to have to take the path of your service that we just stood up. So in my case, I called it ldap.zip.biz, and I think I put 8444 as my port, if I'm not mistaken. And then I'm also going to choose the connection that I just made. And this is going to contain the authorization token. And I will save that, and that should be all that's necessary. Give it a name if you want to override the default. And that's all that should be necessary. Now that we've successfully configured our Okta workflow, now it's time to run our test. So we just click the test button here, put in our same filter we tested with earlier. And we'll run the test. And you can see our LDAP data has been returned successfully in a JSON object that can be parsed by Okta Workflows. And I'm going to run one more test just to make sure we're not cheating here. So in this flow, we actually used the OAuth token that we obtained from our authorization server. What I'm going to do is I'm going to purposely set up one that does not have authentication. So I'll come into the connections. I'm going to create one called NoAuth instead, just to make sure that we're actually securing this API properly. So if I come in here, I create an HTTP connection that has no authentication in it, and I'm going to change this over to use that instead. We will save it, and we will run it. And in this case, we expect this to fail because we did not provide the proper OAuth token. And indeed, it does fail with a 400, meaning we did not properly provide a valid JWT. So if I come back, I'm going to switch my flow back over to my authenticated OAuth token flow and rerun the test and make sure that it still works. And there you have it. So I hope this was a useful video and gives you some ideas for integrating Okta workflows with your on-premise systems. Thanks for watching.